It's my honor to introduce to you someone whom you may well know, Mr. Burke Balch. With a name like Balch, you probably know that he is the father of James Balch, who's in our 11th grade. Mr. Burke Balch is the director of the Powell Center for Medical Ethics at the National Right to Life Committee in Washington, D.C. So he's taking some time aside from his work in Washington, D.C. to be with us today. So we welcome Mr. Balch, and we thank you for taking the time to address matters of Catholic medical ethics to our student body. You should also know that Mr. Balch is a professional registered parliamentarian. He does that as an avocation, and he's one of the authors of the 10th edition of Robert's Rules of Orders. You may have seen a copy of the book in the student lounge. He was one of the authors behind that volume. So it's my high honor to welcome, I hope that you join me in welcoming Mr. Burke Balch.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here today. What's your name?
Joe.
Joe? Yes. Stand up for a minute, please. And you are?
Oh, gosh. I'm Karen.
You're Karen. We're going to make you into a murderer, Karen. Here's a dagger. All right. Karen, I want you to plunge the dagger into Joe. All right. Now, Joe wasn't assaulting Karen, right? This is not in self-defense. They're not combatants in some sort of a just war. Really tough question. According to Catholic teaching, assuming that she'd really done it, would what Karen had done be right or wrong? Wrong, okay? Now, let's suppose, however, that Karen knows a lot about Joe. And she knows that he's really a rapscallion. And in fact, constantly doing pretty bad things. And she's very much afraid that he may not get to heaven. And she wants to be sure that he and everybody gets to heaven, right? That's a good purpose, good objective. So she sees Joe coming out of the confessional. And she says, aha, right now, Joe is pure and clean and ready to go to God, but if he lives much longer, I know he's going to go back to his old ways, and he may wind up in hell. So, out comes the knife. She plunges it in order to send him straight to the loving arms of God. Do you think that's right or wrong? It is wrong because the Church clearly teaches that you can never directly intend to take the life of an innocent human being, even as a means to a good end. Okay? You may sit down. Now, the point is, of course, that you can't ever intend to take an innocent life, even for what would be a good purpose. Okay? So, whether it's because she wants to send Mr. Russo to heaven and be an angel maker, or suppose Mr. Russo was in a great deal of pain, and she didn't want him to be in that pain. All right? So what does she do? You know, this gentleman looks like he's really in pain, so she puts him out of his misery. All right? Well, it's a good thing to try to get people out of their misery, right? It's a good thing to relieve suffering. But you can't do a bad thing, killing an innocent life, in order to accomplish a good end. So even as a means to a good end, it's always wrong to take an innocent life. All right. Now, how many people here have seen the musical My Fair Lady? Okay? For those of you who have not, it's about a linguist, an expert in languages, Henry Higgins, who takes a bet that he can turn a flower girl into a princess, be accepted as a princess, if he can only teach her how to talk genteel, as she says. And so he sets out on a major program to try to teach her to speak as a princess would speak, and he hounds her day and night, and she gets very, very exasperated at being hounded in that way. Eliza, sees Henry Higgins swimming in the sea, and he gets a cramp just a little way from me, and she doesn't rescue him because she wants him to drown, what do you think the Catholic Church would teach about that? It's wrong. Okay? Because, why? Because she was not doing something to save his life, which she could do, in order to bring about his death. Okay? So what the Catholic Church teaches, it's different in law, it's different in the civil law, but what the Catholic Church teaches is that by euthanasia is understood an action or an omission, a failure to do something, which by itself or by intention causes death. All right? Now understand that if we're talking about giving somebody life-saving medical treatment, and you have the control over whether that person gets the life-saving medical treatment or not, and you decide that the person won't get the life-saving medical treatment so that the person will die, with the intention of ensuring that the person dies, then that is, according to Catholic teaching, just as much a case of euthanasia as whipping out the sword and killing the person. Okay? Now, you may have heard about extraordinary treatment versus ordinary treatment. We'll get to that in a little bit. But the important thing to understand right now is that whether that treatment is extraordinary or ordinary, if the reason that you're withholding it, whether it's from somebody else or from yourself, is to bring about the person's death, that is wrong. And it's the same sort of analysis as when we were talking about the effort to, get Mr. Russo and kill him directly for a good purpose. So in other words, even if you say, Grandma is old, she's lived a good life, it's time that she goes to God. We don't want to hold her back from getting to heaven, so we're not going to give her this life-saving medical treatment. We're not going to give her this antibiotic. We're not going to give her this assisted feeding, so that she will die and be with God. All right? That's just as wrong, if that's the reason that you're doing it, as if you had plunged the knife into Grandma in order to send her to heaven. Okay? Now, how many of you drove to school today? All right. How many of you drove yourselves to school? Okay. Now, are you aware that every year about 34,000 people die in automobile accidents? So when you were driving, you were taking your life in your own hands. You were risking death. Now, do you think that was right or wrong? It's right. Why? Because there is a difference in doing something for a good reason, coming to school. I realize there might be some debate about whether that's a good reason or not. But you're undertaking a risk, a known risk, something you foresee, you realize could happen. You could be in a traffic accident and you could die, or your car could kill somebody else. Okay? But you're not driving into school in order to be in an automobile accident, right? You're not driving to school in order to kill somebody else, even though you realize that there's a risk, a greater risk of death that's associated with that. And it's important to understand the difference between doing something that of itself is going to result in death, or in order to bring out somebody's death, even for a good purpose, as a means to a good end, and on the other hand, doing something which in and of itself may increase the risk about bringing out death, but it's directed to doing something else, something that's good. And you accept that risk, but you're not doing it in order to it. Now, if you take your car and you drive it off a 500-foot cliff, that's a little different. Okay? So, critically important to understand that difference. You can never directly intend to take an innocent life and for that purpose fail to provide life-saving medical treatment. On the other hand, there is this difference between acting in order to try and accomplish something that's a good end that may entail an increased risk of death. And the Church teaches that that can be morally acceptable. So, for example, the classic example, even though in modern medicine we really don't have this problem anymore, suppose that somebody is suffering pain, excruciating pain, and the doctors give that person some morphine or other drugs that will get rid of that pain, realizing that there's a danger that the same morphine that suppresses the pain might suppress the person's respiration, increasing the risk that that person might die. Okay? Well, in that case, the Declaration on Euthanasia put out by the Vatican points that in this circumstance, death is in no way intended or sought, even if the risk of it is reasonably taken. The intention is simply to relieve pain effectively, using for this purpose painkillers available to medicine. So if you are trying to do something good, even though there's this risk, when you're making of increased risk of death, it doesn't just apply to painkillers. Suppose, here's this gentleman with his legs out. Maybe one of them is badly damaged in an automobile accident. What's your name?
John.
John. Okay. So if John gets up, we'll see how good an actor he is. Whenever he walks with a pronounced limp. So show us your best limp. Okay, great. Okay.
Oh, whatever.
Now he questioned he's got both legs in bad shape. All right. So there could be an operation, let's say, that has a chance, maybe it's a 60% chance, of fixing his legs. But, of course, there are risks associated with it. He could die on the operating table,
Do you want me
right?
to die now?
Give it a try.
No, thanks.
All right, you can sit down. So the point is, it's not unethical to do something to try and suppress pain or fix a problem, even though that may increase the risk of death. Okay? And often when you're making treatment decisions, it's not clear-cut. There may be different alternative ways that you can try to treat a particular problem that on the one hand might have a greater risk of side effects, but less of a chance of saving a life. And then there's another treatment that has a lower risk of side effects, but also a lesser chance of saving a life. And you might ethically pick one or the other of those, assuming that you're doing it, wanting to try to save your life or the life of the person whose treatment decision you're making this about. Okay? Now, the question that you always have to ask, sort of as an examination of conscience when you're making this decision, is, are you making a decision about treatment, maybe a decision not to undergo an operation or not to provide some sort of drug? Are you doing that in spite of the chance that that would cause death or because of the prospect that it would increase the risk of death? Okay? So when a treatment decision is being made, it's important to think through carefully and accurately what your real intent is and what's really going on here. Because particularly in today's culture of death, there's a tremendous impetus to withhold treatment because we think that somebody's life really is debilitated, has a poor quality of life, is not worth living. And then we sort of say, oh, well, it's just extraordinary treatment anyway, so let's not provide the life-saving treatment. If the reason you're not providing it is because that will increase the risk of death, because that person will die, then that is morally wrong. Now, does that mean that you always have to provide life-saving treatment? Well, let's think about two different grocery stores. Okay? Now, let's see. You, sir, your name is?
Max.
Max. Come out here and take this broom, please. All right. And you are? Etta, please take this broom. All right. Now, have you ever been in a grocery store and you go to the produce aisle? You know, where they might have fruit and bananas and lettuce. Okay? Now, often it's packaged up nowadays, but sometimes that fruit or the lettuce or the other vegetables are sort of out there openly displayed. And in the natural tendency of things, as people are going through and picking out and seeing whether something is ripe or not, some of that may fall on the floor. In fact, that's how this gentleman got lame in the first place. See, he was walking into a grocery store, and he didn't notice there was a piece of lettuce that had fallen to the floor, and he slipped on it and he fell.
I thought I died in a car accident.
Well, that was a different incident. You've had 9 lives like a cat. All right. Now, because grocery stores are aware of the fact that this happens, what they may do, and what they certainly should do, is try to sweep up. Now, over here, in this grocery store, I'm sorry, remind me of your name again?
Max.
Max. Max has been employed to sweep this aisle. And that's his sole job. So start sweeping. Go back and forth. Just sweep back and forth this way. No, I mean walk up and down the aisle, okay? Turn around and go down and sweep out. Keep doing that, okay? That's your job, okay? So every day, while the store is open, he walks from one side of the aisle to the end and turns around and sweeps back to make sure that nothing's going to fall. But as it happens, while he's doing this, turns around and he's walking back, okay, just as he's going, a piece of lettuce falls. And I come in to buy it, and I slip and break my leg. And I sue the grocery store. Okay? Now, on the other hand, let's start with that. Okay? What do you think would happen if I sued the grocery store and wanted the grocery store to pay me for being negligent? Do you think I'd win the case? Somebody said possibly. A lot of people said no. Here's the point. The law imposes a duty of care that a reasonable person would use. And if the grocery store is taking measures to try to sweep up, then in something that a reasonable grocery store would do, then it's not going to be liable to somebody who's injured, because the grocery store isn't an insurer. It doesn't guarantee that anybody comes into it is never going to go into any harm or any way. It just has a duty of taking reasonable care. Now, as a matter of fact, this approach, oh, you've stopped your work, keep going, please. This is pretty much above and beyond what you would expect. Okay? Now, over here, on the other hand, this young lady is employed to sweep the path, but does it only once a week. Okay? So only once a week. That's why she's standing stationary. This is not the part in the week when she's supposed to be sweeping. All right? Now, if somebody comes in and slips and falls and breaks a leg and sues, what do you think the court will say? Do you think the court will say that the person recovers because the grocery store breached its duty of care? Okay? Very, very likely. All right, the both of you can return your brooms to the front and sit down. Here's the point. There are two extremes here. Okay? On the one hand, there's the extreme of the grocery store that's really going above and beyond what any reasonable expectation would be about sweeping that. They've really been taking extraordinary steps to try to keep that aisle clean. Okay? On the other hand, we've got this other grocery store that has really fallen below the ordinary standard of care. Now, you can't have a mathematical calculation. It's not as though we have something written out that says, now, the grocery store aisle must be swept every hour, or the grocery store must be swept every 20 minutes, or the grocery floor must be swept every 3 hours. Instead, what would happen is you probably go before a jury, and the jury would sort of make a judgment after hearing testimony, for example, of what most grocery stores tended to do, all right, what was the usual and customary amount to which they swept and so forth, and whether that was reasonable. And based on that, they decide whether or not the reasonable duty of care had been fulfilled. Okay? So the point is, what is true of the grocery store here is really true of just about all moral obligations that we have. That is to say, usually we're held to do what would be reasonably expectable, to the extent that you'd ordinarily have to do, but we're not expected to make extraordinary efforts to fulfill that duty of care. So, for example, what do you have to do? What does the church say you have to do about Sunday Mass? You're supposed to go to Sunday Mass? Mass on Sundays and holy days? Okay? But suppose that you are traveling, and it is very, very difficult in your layover between two flights to get off the grounds of the airport, find a church, and go to Mass. Okay? It might be possible. Perhaps you could have looked up and seen which was the closest church to the airport, and you've got a 2.5-hour layover, and so you rush out and you rush to the Mass, and then you come back and go back through security again. So by extraordinary efforts, you might be able to get to Mass. But it's beyond what's reasonably expectable. Okay, you have an duty to make ordinary efforts to get to Mass. Okay, suppose you're a pioneer. Okay, out in a locale where the closest Catholic church is 300 miles away. Okay, you could possibly make it to Mass, but it would take an extraordinary effort. Now, notice, very important point here. It's not wrong to make that extraordinary effort. In fact, it may be praiseworthy. It probably is praiseworthy to make that extraordinary effort. But you're not morally required to go above and beyond what is ordinarily acceptable. Okay? Well, what does this have to do with medical treatment? Okay? Let's suppose that you have a grandmother who is very sick, and she has a heart condition, a very rare type of heart condition. As it happens, Vladimir Putin, anybody know who Vladimir Putin is? Who's Vladimir Putin? He was the Russian president, now he's the prime minister, but he's pulling most of the strings behind the scenes. Let's suppose that Vladimir Putin has this same rare heart ailment. And because of who Vladimir Putin is, a lot of resources have been put into looking into experimental treatments for this heart condition. And in fact, the doctors in the Kremlin have come up with one of these experimental treatments. And so in one place in the world, in the Kremlin hospital, this treatment is available. Now, do you have an obligation to get your grandmother onto the plane, get to Russia, pound at the doors of the Kremlin hospital, and make sure that she gets this treatment? What do you think? How many think you have an obligation to do it? How many think you don't? All right. That is, in an exaggerated sense, a notion of what is extraordinary, what is going above and beyond the standard that's required. And what is the standard that's required? Well, it changes. It's different. It depends upon where you're located, okay? If you're in an urban environment and a certain treatment is regularly available at the hospitals, okay, then you have as your ordinary duty of care to go to that hospital and try to get that treatment. If you're out in the boondocks and way, way far away, that may not be required. If you're in the standard of care in a village in Africa or Asia may be very different from what the standard of care is in New York City or Boston, okay? And it varies upon the period of time, okay? Modern medicine improves, we hope. So things that were unusual and only experimental back in the 1950s may be very common and ordinary and regularly available today, okay? So what the church teaches is that there is an obligation to get ordinary treatment. Now, but not an obligation to get extraordinary treatment. Now, part of what you do in making a judgment is a decision about what's known as proportionality. And that means you look at, on the one hand, what's the benefit to be expected from the treatment, what's the probability, for example, that this treatment will save somebody's life, save your life, versus what are the burdens associated with it. How difficult is it to get this treatment? What sort of side effects are to be expected? What is the prospect that those side effects would occur? And as we talked about before, just as when we're saying you can make different decisions about whether you're going, let's give you an example. Let's suppose that somebody has gangrene in their leg. And there's an antibiotic available to try to fight that gangrene, but it only has, let's say, a 30% or 40% chance of success. But if it's successful, you'll save the leg. On the other hand, let's say that if you amputate the leg with a gangrene on it, you have a 90% chance of living, but of course you lose the leg. Provided that your objective is to try to save the leg, you might ethically decide to try to go with the antibiotics, okay? As long as you're not intending to increase the risk of death. Or alternatively, you might ethically say, go ahead and take off the leg, even though obviously it means that you're only going to have one leg, all right? So these judgments of proportionality in making a judgment what treatment is appropriate are ethically responsible and appropriate judgments, okay? The next thing, though, that you have to recall is that there are some things, you know, about what is available and normally provided to those with a similar illness or injury in given circumstances of the time or place. And that's what we're talking about, you know, are you in New York City or are you out somewhere in Africa in the hinterlands? Now, there are some things which are clearly so ordinary that they become a part of what might even be called not treatment at all, but normal care. And one of these is the supplying of food and fluids. Think about it this way. If you are ill, you may need life-saving medical treatment. But whether you're ill or not, do you need food and water? If you go without it for very long, no matter how well you are able, you know, what good condition you're in, you're going to die. It's one of the ordinary means of sustenance. And even if one has to have assistance, for example, my aunt who has Alzheimer's disease and lives at home with us isn't able through swallowing to take in all the food that she needs for nutrition. So she has a feeding tube that's sort of an opening in her stomach, and basically liquid food that's pretty much the same as any other food, except it's been fortified with vitamins and so forth. There's a pump that involves getting that into her stomach so she can live and continue to survive, all right? So the church teaches that provision of food and fluids, even when you need the assistance of something like a tube, is an ordinary requirement. An ordinary means that in principle always has to be provided. Now there are circumstances, if you're somebody who's imminently dying and you won't be able to digest the food in time for it to preserve your life, if it's not going to fulfill its objective of providing nutrition and hydration, then it's something that obviously you don't have to do. Now, let me quickly address, because I know that the time is getting late, and speaking of food and fluids, you're probably getting hungry. One thing that a lot of people make a mistake about, you often hear this, even from very Orthodox Catholics, is, well, respirators, the machines that help people believe, they're extraordinary, so you don't need to have respirators. That's really a fundamental misunderstanding, and what it comes from is that back in the 1950s, there were a lot of children in particular who were stricken with polio. And one of the effects of that polio was that it made it very difficult for them to breathe. So they came up with, doctors first came up with what they called the iron lungs. And this was a very, you may have seen the pictures of children sort of lying in this big tube with the lung that we were breathing for them. And so it was sort of a very experimental treatment at the time. And some Catholic moralists were writing about the difference between ordinary and extraordinary treatment, and they gave respirators as an example of what would be extraordinary treatment. And in the 1950s, it was extraordinary treatment. But today, respirators are commonly used and available, certainly in a country like the United States, all the time. So it certainly is not the case that even if they were once extraordinary, that they're now extraordinary. Now, there's another point I want to emphasize again. Even when a treatment is extraordinary, the Church makes clear it is optional. It's not forbidden, all right? And it may be praiseworthy to get it. So it's never wrong to seek, for example, experimental treatment. Experimental treatment, by definition, is extraordinary. But if nobody ever had experimental treatment, we'd never have advances in medicine. Now, the final but critical point to understand here is that these standards that the Church teaches about are often misunderstood because of the influence of what Pope John Paul II called the culture of death. And that is the attitude, the quality of life perspective that sees, as the Pope wrote, the growing number of elderly and disabled people as intolerable and too burdensome, holding that a hopelessly impaired life no longer has any value. And of course, what the Church affirms strongly is what's known as the intrinsic value and personal dignity of every human being. And it does not matter what the circumstances of that life may be. So that even if someone is seriously ill or disabled in the exercise of higher functions like mental functions, that person will always be a human being and never, even though we hear terms about people who are, vegetables or in a persistent vegetative state, you're always a human being. So, a very, very important point, and that is that a means, this is a quote from the Bishop's Pro-Life Committee in the United States, a means that is considered ordinary or proportionate for other patients should not be considered extraordinary for severely impaired patients solely because of a judgment that their lives are not worth living. And it's very easy to slip into that mistake, okay? It's very easy when we're talking about grandma who's incontinent and in the nursing home, or somebody like Terry Schiavo, whose mental disabilities are very severe. It's very easy to sort of start saying, well, we really don't have to go the extra mile in providing the antibiotic. We really don't have to go ahead and perform this life-saving operation. Maybe we don't even have to give artificial feeding. And when people start talking about that, even if they say, well, we wouldn't kill her directly, we wouldn't give her a lethal injection, but we're just not going to give grandma all that extraordinary treatment. Is the treatment really extraordinary? Or are we thinking, grandma really, it's time for her to go, okay? So, to put it in a slightly different perspective, whenever you're making this decision for yourself or somebody else, ask yourself if the patient, instead of being an 80-year-old grandmother or somebody with a severe disability, or let's say a young man tooling around in a Mustang, but had the same illness, would the treatment be withheld? So do a little thought experiment when you're thinking about grandma, and think about, well, if this was a healthy 20-year-old who suddenly got the same illness, what treatment would we give that person? And if we would give that person the treatment, the young man, we shouldn't say, oh ho, guess what, because grandma's 80, that suddenly becomes extraordinary treatment.